So I'll just choose one because I've had lots of emails. I choose one from Western Canada and I'll choose one from Eastern Canada. So Western Canada, there was one in May of 2023, a soccer dad. And he said, "Hello, I'm sadly writing to seek some help. My daughter loves soccer, and at the young age of 9, she just had to play a match against a boy who identifies as a girl on the other girls' team. I later found out that my daughter's own club has issued a policy saying that anyone can be a girl and therefore play in the girls' team. This boy then the boy they played against was bigger, faster, stronger than most of the girls. And though it wasn't the only factor, our girls lost 7-1 and were visibly intimidated when playing against this trans boy. Help, please help," is what he ended with, all caps. I suppose since I was the only coach in Canada speaking out, he was reaching out to me. He said after that, in a follow-up email, that his daughter just wanted to quit and she was probably going to quit. Now there's another one. If I go to the other parent on Eastern Canada as another example in trampoline gymnastics, that's happening this month. At the trampoline gymnastics competition, my 11-year-old daughter has experienced sex discrimination by being forced to compete against a 15-year-old boy. So it's not a boy and girl only, it's age differences here. She has also been forced to change and be housed on sports trips in the same spaces as this boy. She is not allowed to compete at her championships unless she accepts that this boy as a girl. I cannot allow her privacy to be violated, so she is not going to the championship, but he is going. She is being left out while he is being supported and celebrated. I am sad. My daughter and I have major anxiety around this. I just needed to talk to someone. Things obviously are not going to change, and if they do, it is not going to be soon enough for my children.
My guest today is Coach Linda Blade. She is the author of Unsporting: How Trans Activism and Science Denial Are Destroying Sport. Recently, John Oliver used his Last Week Tonight show to attack the integrity of women's sports and those who dare to defend women's sports from cheating males. In particular, Oliver smeared SheWon.org, a website that crowdsources information about transgender-identifying males in women's sports. I reached out to the website, and they told me to ask Coach Blade about their work. Coach Blade is a Canadian. She holds a PhD in kinesiology, and she has been president of Athletics Alberta since 2014. Coach Blade, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Matt.
Coach Blade, for our listeners who don't know you, could you please take a moment to tell them about your background?
You said I was president of Athletics Alberta. That was true until 2023, at which point I stepped down at the AGM because I was coming into my 10th year and I realized it was time to move on and do bigger things. So that's no longer true, but I did spend almost a decade working on policy for track and field in Alberta. And before that, I had been an athlete in the heptathlon, NCAA Division I All-American, Canadian champion in heptathlon and track and field. And then I got my PhD in sports sciences and international diploma teaching coaches how to coach, international certification for athletics. And then after that, part of that was going into Islamic countries and teaching Muslim women how to coach the girls. So I did a sort of an international tour there for a while, helping to teach coaches. Then I got back to Canada and I was a sport performance professional consultant, helping athletes in more than 15 sports, delivering basic foundational movement patterns and improving their physique for their sport. And then I became president. And then after that, I was hit with this policy that I didn't agree with from the national governing body in Canada. And from there, that was around 2018, I made it my mission to speak out against including males in female sports.
We are here to discuss one of the most upsetting topics in this whole discourse to me. Sports is much more public facing than, say, prisons, which is another issue to talk about on a different day. So the viewer sees the unfairness of Leah Thomas on the trophy stand. They instantly resent it before they even think. There's no area in transgender activism that so obviously and publicly humiliates the observer, not just the competitor, but the observer. And then someone like John Oliver will come along and add to that humiliation by telling us it's not happening or it doesn't matter. So, top line, what is your overall response to John Oliver?
John Oliver does not know what he's talking about. It's really quite pathetic. So he tries to pretend like this isn't happening. There are at least 850 males who identify as trans who participate in sports. And we probably have undercounted those. And he acts like there's no difference between men and women, that we should just all accept each other. And that, I mean, there is a distinct advantage that male bodies have over female bodies. That's just a fact. Anybody who's ever been around sports knows that. Look at the world records in any sport, swimming, track and field, anything. I mean, the differences in and advantages that males have is massive. Like in running, it's up to 10 to 15%. In jumping, it's 15 to 20%. In throwing, it's 40%. Weightlifting, 50%. And delivery of a punch in boxing, up to 160%. So it's just crazy. I mean, and even prepubescent children, everybody talks about the puberty divide and that males have this advantage after puberty. But even before puberty, little boys have 4% better performances than girls in running and jumping, and still almost 30% in upper body strength and throwing things and like pull-ups and stuff. So it's just not correct to say that there's any age in which a male athlete, man or boy, should be allowed to compete against female athletes. It's just not, it's not ethical. It's not right. And some of the points John Oliver made were just so incredible. Like he was acting like somehow, because one or two data points might be off here or there, that our entire objection is somehow undermined by some little misquote here or there. He attacked Reem Al-Salem, like the United Nations Special Rapporteur, who did a really comprehensive report in August of 2024, a United Nations report on the violence against women and girls in sports. It was well referenced, and for some reason he went out of his way to attack that report. But you know what? It turns out that the person who was the fact checker for the John Oliver show last week tonight is a trans-identified male named DMD Brent, D in quotes, Brent. The fact checker was pushing an agenda. It was so clear. And John Oliver, I'm surprised that he would have allowed his show to be undermined to the extent that it was. And, I just think it's incredible. Like Sharon Byron, the executive director of Women's Liberation Front, Wolf, I mean, basically said it well. She said to the Brent in an email, even before the John Oliver show, it was already explained to this fact checker Brent that you question the accuracy and some of the ways that SheWon.org calculates losses to women and girls, but you miss that sports authorities and organizations like the NC2A and IOC aren't compiling data. So we have to, somebody else has to compile it. There's an implied sense of outrage. This is again, continuing with Sharon's quote. There's an implied sense of outrage in your questions. How dare women keep track of stolen sports titles? That smacks, and that smacks of progressive misogyny, like to just to question that women should even be able to somehow, question it or to collect data on discrimination that is happening to us is crazy. And and to question the advantages or to say that there is no data, there's no study showing that, if you put men on hormonal mitigation, force them to reduce their testosterone, that there's no study showing that they maintain their advantages. That's false. There has been at least 19 studies showing that even after years, up to years of taking testosterone mitigation or suppression, trans-identified males still have a massive advantage over women in sports. So the studies have been done, and John was acting like we don't have any studies. What are we supposed to do? Well, the other thing about that would be is even if that was true, which it isn't, if you don't have studies that show that male advantage is completely mitigated by some sort of medical intervention, if you don't have those studies, you should never be putting those guys into women's sports until you figure that out. Why let the thief into the house and then question whether you should let him in? None of it made any sense whatsoever, Matt. I don't know what enticed somebody who has a reputation as a pundit. I don't know what would have enticed him to go to that degree of an own goal, shooting yourself in the foot. It's astounding that he would allow that to happen in his show. And I'm embarrassed for him. Basically, it's just embarrassment. I feel for him.
Pretend for a moment that I am sports illiterate like John Oliver. What's your elevator pitch to persuade me against letting that fabulous man in the wig and the skirt play ice hockey with my teenage daughter? Okay, maybe that's not good, but what about running or some other non-contact sport? Why can't we all just get along and pretend together? And if I say it in a British accent, Linda, will I sound smart enough to convince you?
The elevator pitch is it's not ethical, it's not fair, and it's not safe. And even if it's an individual sport like running, it's still not safe because what happens is it doesn't stop there. Males take over the podium positions and then they go into the locker rooms. And then when they go into the locker rooms, as I have warned my Association Canada, if we say one or two males or men can go into the locker room with the little girls and the women, then the pervert and the predators that are in the spectators in the stand start going in there. Like, where do you draw the line? So it's just basically the entire realm becomes colonized by male bodies. And it's completely exclusionary of females at the end of the day. Over time, the female category would be completely males, if this keeps going on. So then it begs the question why we should have two categories at all. And if you erase the two categories, you and I both know there will never be women in sports at all.
Oliver specifically attacked SheWon.org, which is a website where people upload instances of males and female sports, basically crowdsourced reporting. You mentioned it a moment ago. Now, you're not here as an official representative of the organization, but what can you tell us about the people behind that website?
I didn't find out about it except it's organically as I was using online, social media sometime about a year ago. And the truth is that we all should be appreciating the SheWon.org site because it's the only entity that's even attempting to collect data on this phenomenon of men and boys competing in women's sports. And it's establishing the fact that it is really happening. more frequently than our deniers, the deniers would like to pretend. And under that sort of topic, we have to know what is happening. You know, if we're going to fight this battle to recapture women's sports and realign it as a sex based entity, we have to have somebody tracking, because the sports organizations and media simply will not track it. They will not report on it. They will try to hide it. But the second thing I appreciate about the website is that the women involved, like I started doing some background checks and backdoor sort of questions and emails asking them, especially after the UN report, I was asking them about their methodology and that sort of thing, and trying to make sure that when we were quoting numbers that, you know, we could trust what they were doing. And I found out that they were more than happy to explain to me. The women have impeccable ethics. They are very thorough with their methodology. The data is only listed publicly after very careful verification, and the verification is a stepwise, thorough process where, yes, people voluntarily submit information they've heard or seen, or a parent might see something happening at a track meet, for example, or something happens and somebody clicks. There's a link on the site, on the website, where you can click and submit information on a male winning and female competition. There are public submissions, but they are vetted, and they are very careful to find out a backup evidence that it happened, the date, the place, the time, and find out the result sheets from an organization where that happened. They collect news sources on incidents. They back check on with the sporting governing body whether that event actually took place. They find out the name of the trans-identified male, and then work it out backwards sometimes to find out which competitions they were in, and then find the result sheets, and then identify the women whose medals were usurped. And then sometimes it's like a video clip, and then they track that down. And so what I like about it is the information delivery on the website is super clear and informative. And just on that note, I want to just reinforce the fact that the website She Won is dedicated specifically. What I like about the fact is that they're naming the female athletes who should have gotten the attention. They are naming the female athletes who were displaced by the males. So their focus isn't on the males or trying to out the males or name them. They're specifically focusing on who was displaced by a male and what her medal should have been, and what date that happened, what competition it happened in, what sport. And then you can do a lot of analysis based on the sport, that sort of thing. So it's a very simple, easy to see, like shewon.org. If you go to the main page, is like, it gives you the breakdown. When the UN report was written, I think it was something like 900 medals had been, won or taken away from the females. And now that number is already up to 2,212 as of today. So it's rising fast, because I think we're still, there's this massive backlog. They're having trouble with, they have so much data in the reporting database. So there's a reporting database, they vet that, and then the scaled down version, or the verified version database, is then what you see on the main page on the website. And there's just mountains of data they haven't been able to verify yet. So there's many, many different ways in which that is being underreported. And the other thing that they do is their vetting identifies when there's intentionally wrong information submitted. Like, there's a lot of trans activists trying to undermine them by submitting crank submissions, incorrect information, or sometimes people are sending in things that are just completely insufficient. It might be like a track meet somewhere that they didn't even have the name, or some swimming competition on a certain day, but they don't know the state where that happened. So there's a lot of challenges to this, and these women are working tirelessly to try to get verified data on the website. They don't put it there unless they're absolutely sure of what they found. And I was very impressed. I'm very impressed with that.
I do want to interject here that
Hmm.
the impression you just gave is entirely different from the one that John Oliver presented. He
Hmm.
presented it as though this database is completely unreliable. No one is fact checking it. And in fact, what you are saying is that there have been efforts to suborn this database that they have discovered, that they have
Yes.
been so careful as to go through each report and figure out which ones are the false ones.
Hmm. Yes. And so what I have been impressed with is that they will go out of their way to not post something if they even have an inkling that that thing is a false submission, because they do value credibility, they do value accuracy and reliability. And what I'll just say, it's the sense that I get, and we all get from the different ways in which things are being underreported, is that what you see on that she1.org website is probably only 10% of what's going on. Like there's just such a huge mountain of verifiable data, data that could actually be on the website, but they don't have enough volunteers to even, like every entry takes about 15 minutes because they have to go back and that's on average. So they have to go back and follow up on, let's say they go back to the sport organization and they go to the results sheet of a certain competition, look up who got third, fourth, or fifth, um, and then they cross check with other information they get on that event. And so there is a backlog of hundreds of entries and many hundreds of entries they haven't even been able to get to. So that's already things that could have been verified. They just don't have enough volunteers. Okay, and then there's just the insufficient data ones, and then um, there's my concern about the children, how much is happening at grassroots level. And in places like Canada, it doesn't matter whatever level, people are too afraid to report this or talk about it. There's the very short, small reporting, very sort of limited reporting on the phenomenon of men in women's sports, because in Canada, it's actually, people think it's against the law to even say anything about it, which isn't necessarily true, but they're just too afraid to go there because of Bill C-16. But I'm concerned about the children. I am getting emails all the time of parents who are petrified to say anything publicly. I can read a couple of emails um, was sent to me just as an example, if you'd like. But
You're
I have,
saying that these are examples of this happening further down the ladder of
yeah,
sports.
with little kids. So
Oh,
that
oh,
it'll
please
become
go
obvious.
go
Okay,
ahead,
so
please.
there's a parent. So I'll just choose one because I've had lots of emails. I choose one from Western Canada and I'll choose one from Eastern Canada. So Western Canada, there was one in May of 2023, a soccer dad. And he said, "Hello, I'm sadly writing to seek some help. My daughter loves soccer, and at the young age of 9, she just had to play a match against a boy who identifies as a girl on the other girls' team. I later found out that my daughter's own club has issued a policy saying that anyone can be a girl and therefore play in the girls' team. This boy then the boy they played against was bigger, faster, stronger than most of the girls. And though it wasn't the only factor, our girls lost 7-1 and were visibly intimidated when playing against this trans boy. Help, please help, is what he ended with, all caps. I suppose since I was the only coach in Canada speaking out, he was reaching out to me. He said after that, in a follow-up email, that his daughter just wanted to quit and she was probably going to quit. Now there's another one. If I go to the other parent on Eastern Canada, is another example in trampoline gymnastics that's happening this month. At the trampoline gymnastics competition, my 11-year-old daughter has experienced sex discrimination by being forced to compete against a 15-year-old boy. So it's not even it's not a boy and girl only, it's age differences here. She has also been forced to change and be housed on sports trips in the same spaces as this boy. She is not allowed to compete at her championships unless she accepts that this boy as a girl. I cannot allow her privacy to be violated, so she is not going to the championship, but he is going. She is being left out while he is being supported and celebrated. I am sad. My daughter and I have major anxiety around this. I just needed to talk to someone. Things obviously are not going to change, and if they do, it is not going to be soon enough for my children.
Linda, oh, why do you suppose there is a quiet groundswell of support for candidates like Donald Trump and Mr. Polyev? I think that's how you pronounce his name up there in Canada.
Yeah.
Well, why do you suppose there is this quiet groundswell of support for such candidates when they do stand up to the trans lobby? When that does happen, why do you suppose there are people out there who have quietly built up this resentment? Is it because their daughters are losing their sports, do you think? What do you suppose is the impact downstream, not just for girls, which is something you should talk about, but for society of having boys and girls, little girls' sports?
I think it's more than the sport. See, everybody says sports is the tip of the spear because it's the obvious thing that people can see. So, Matt, what's happening is if we live in a society where you're not allowed to say something that's fundamentally truthful, like there are boys and there are girls and sex is binary. If you can't even say that there is male and female and that's how we reproduce, if you're not allowed to say things like that, then we live in a society that's totalitarian. We're not allowed to express ourselves openly and honestly. And the fear that everybody feels is palpable. And, and people are feeling vulnerable in either direction because there are, for example, a pharmacists that I know about who, for example, with the transitioning or wrong sex hormones and with children, like children who are self-identifying because they are taught it in the school. So they're being indoctrinated that they might have been born in the wrong body. And now if they go and try to get, if the doctor says that, and then they get a requisition to get, a cross-sex or a wrong sex hormone or a puberty blocker, there are pharmacists out there who feel like, well, they have to do it for their profession, but they know that at the end of the day, there's going to be a big backlash for them because they are on the front lines of them giving these things, these products and these pharmaceuticals, that they're doing damage to healthy bodies, and it's not necessary. I mean, just because some child was, repeating what they, learned at school in Canada, if you don't affirm that, somehow you're breaking the law. So it's just putting everybody in a bind. Like, they don't know what to do. They know what's wrong. And that was just an example, like a pharmacist. But I mean, you all the way down the line, whether you're a teacher, pharmacist, doctor, I know medical doctors, and actually I've heard of therapists who won't even take some children because they don't want to get in trouble for then not affirming them in the way of the cult, of the ideology. It's downstream. So the sport thing is just the obvious thing that people can talk about and get mad about, but it's the sport issue of trying to deny that there's a biological sex called male and female, and those are distinct. That thing allows us to talk about things that are really causing people consternation, sort of behind the scenes. And so I think it's just a way for people to express their outrage of the feeling bewildered, the bewilderment everybody feels. Like, why can't we just be logical and express what's out there? Like, I was in for example, as a coach in 2021, I had to upgrade my CPR and first aid. And even in that course, the instructor took it upon themselves to tell us there was more than two genders. And it's like, no, I mean, because he was saying about how to palpate a person's, if a person has breasts, how to palpate that properly. I mean, that's going to be a woman, first of all. But then I said, well, that's going to be a woman. And I mean, you have to know what you're dealing with if you're going to help save somebody. Anyway, the point is that then there was this big argument in the class whether I should be allowed to say that. And so in every aspect of what we do in society now, you're being asked to deny reality. And then I said in that whole, and nobody could argue with me when I said, there's not a single person in Canada who is alive today that has come into existence in any other way than the union of a male and a female. That is foundational. After that, you can say people have different personalities, different genders, whatever they like. I don't believe that there's all these hundreds of genders. Those are personalities. People might present a little bit more masculine or feminine, no matter what sex you are. But fundamentally, we are born with a given one of two sexes. And to say that in Canada puts you at great risk. And it's just weird. Social risk if you're at a dinner party, or career risk. If you're in a certain workspace where it's woke and you're not allowed to say that. So yeah, I mean, that the resentment people are feeling behind closed doors, that they cannot express themselves freely and in a way that everybody knows to be true. It's wearing down everybody. It's really tiresome. And again, for John Oliver to come out and act like we're all super crazy and here's the other thing about John Oliver. He makes it sound like, oh, it's just a piffle. It's just, it's a little thing. Who cares? Well, if that's the truth, then why do they care to come into women's sports? Like, nothing that he says, it wasn't true, but even if it were to be true, it didn't make sense. See, that's the point of it. It was just completely mind-numbing.
Your book explains how all of this happened administratively. That is, no one ever asks the female athletes what they want. The last time that happened in 1996, which you write about, the Olympics Committee got the wrong answer from the one they wanted, so they stopped asking. And
Right.
so there's never any sort of public debate. The so-called trans athlete invariably comes in the back door and gets special privileges from organizations. There are a few reasons for that, of course. Can you just lay out for our listeners what the reasons are? And of course, you'll have to focus on the Canadian example with C16, but can you just lay that out for us?
There's one entity in Canada that is called the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, and their mandate was after there was a huge controversy scandal in the 1988 Olympics when sprinter Ben Johnson, the Canadian, beat Carl Lewis, the American, and it turned out that Ben had been doping. The Canadian had been doping, and so by 2003 there was this new entity that was supposed to be in place to make sure people weren't doping in Canada, so that we'd never be embarrassed like that again. And so basically, it was the anti-cheating. Let's put it this way: there was this entity called the CCES, Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, the anti-cheating agency. Let's put it that way, in sport. So they stuck to their mandate until 2014. From 2003, so about a decade, to 2014. If you look at the annual reports, every time was all the efforts they were making at informing sports about anti-doping and collaborating with WADA, World Anti-Doping Association, and all of that. And all of a sudden in 2014, they want now to be even more ethical in terms of the new ideology, and say, now to be ethical, you have to also allow anybody to identify into whatever sport category they want. And it's just, it was just astonishing because they still enforce the no doping. So if you were a female athlete in a women's sport and you were taking a drug, you would maybe get maximal 8 maybe even 9% advantage over somebody. Yet it was okay to allow a male into a women's sport who might have up to a 50% advantage. I mean, none of it made any from the moment they went woke, let's put it that way. The minute they adopted the ideology, they pushed the narrative that every sporting association in Canada should have a gender self ID, which, you know, if somebody just states whatever gender they think they are, they should just be allowed to go into that sport category. And that's what I ran into in 2008. And I was like, whoa, like that can't be right, because I knew the difference between men and women. Furthermore, I knew that ultimately you could be male, a trans person who was born male, or a trans person born female. The born female ones stay in women's sports, even though they call themselves trans or non-binary. But we accept the female athletes accept the trans who happen to be born female, the non-binary ones. So really, if a male born person identifies as trans and then wants to come over to the female category, they're also discriminating against the trans who are female. So basically, it's not even about trans at that point, because all collected in the female category are trans who are male born and trans who are female born. And guess which ones win? The male born ones. So it's not even really, our point is, why can't they stick to their own sex category like the females do, and just the men and respect them even if they want to present as feminine in the male category? That would be far more empowering as far as I'm concerned. So none of it actually made sense to me, Matt. And so, but nevertheless, that CCES organization had the power to compel every sport organization nationally to adopt that policy. And they would literally they got funding from the Justin Trudeau government to send out their prophets and proselytizers. I was at a AGM as president of my provincial governing body with all the different presidents were there, and the National, Athletics Canada. And we were sitting in this AGM and they said, oh, we'll have a special guest speaker. And it turns out that the CCES had sent one of their apostles to our meeting to tell us about how 12% difference is no big deal. And we're all looking at each other like, what? I don't know. It's just the whole thing. And so I asked the question, like, how can they say that? Because, we're talking about track and field where 12% difference is you don't make it past the heats. It just was so bewildering. And also, just so you know, just for comparison, in 2021, the Nike Vaporfly, everybody was setting world records on the Nike distance running team. Their times in the marathon were just completely so much faster than everybody else. It turned out that the sole of the running shoe, everybody suspected that this was the new, with the carbon fiber in the soles, and it made it bouncier, and just, it looked like something about that running shoe was giving that particular team of runners a massive, massive advantage. So they actually put it to the test, and it turned out that in the men's category only, just male marathon runners, they did discover that wearing the Nike Vaporfly running shoe gave the men who wore it, a 4% advantage. And they were setting world records with this. 4%. Well, that's the same difference as a little boy has over a little girl. So when it's between men and a man has a 4% advantage because of the running shoe he's wearing, they made that illegal. Like that you can't have that big of a gap. You can't have, you have to either have everybody have access to that running shoe, and then there are now new parameters for marathon running shoes where you can't have this advantage. So it's not okay for a group of marathon running men to have a 4% advantage in running shoe. And yet we have some, prophets of the woke come and tell sports organizations that if there's a 12% difference between performances of one group and another, we're supposed to disregard that and just accept everybody. And that's even the minimal. Running is the minimal, like that 10 to 12% is the minimal difference between men and women. It goes up from there. So I'm like, you sit in these meetings and you listen to these people and you know that as soon as you start asking questions, I asked the question, I started asking questions and they immediately got this person out of the room. They wouldn't let me ask them any more questions. And then of course at coffee time, nobody wants to talk to you. It's just oppressive. Socially, it's just you, if you speak out or you tell the truth, you're just not allowed to say it. You're just not allowed. And so it's been through the back door of such a powerful entity being supported by the federal government that says you must put this policy, you must put this particular policy in your eligibility document.
This is not a debate. Yes, the famous line. This is not a debate. We cannot have a debate because it would be actual genocide to have a debate. You also wrote that there's no way to balance the so-called right of inclusion of a transgender identifying male athlete and the human rights of a female athlete. Most civil rights questions come down to a balancing of rights, but no balance is possible here because sports is about biology and not identity. Um, and this is, of course, where we get accused of actual genocide because, you know, it's literally Auschwitz unless you let Leah Thomas on the trophy stand.
Oh
Um,
my
the,
God.
co- the complaint that sports is too binary. It sounds very much like the complaint that sports are too hard.
Yeah.
John Oliver, for example, admits he's not crazy about sports. Did this start with the participation trophies? Did we get too soft like John Oliver's brain? What happened to us, do you think, that let this happen?
Ironically, it's come full arc because it started, remember in the early 2000s, almost every, I know you probably were in school or I had child in school or something, but in the around late 90s, early 2000s, there was this whole thing, don't bully. And that was fine. Everybody wanted to, not bully people. You're not supposed to say bad things to people. Yeah. So that bullying now has been, as soon as the gender ideology came in full force and supercharged by everybody having smartphones in their pockets and social media and this new sparkly thing called inclusion. Now, if you didn't accept just somebody's word for it, that they happen to be the opposite sex, now somehow they could weaponize that whole concept of bullying. I think that's really where like they found an inconvenient weapon in the bullying thing. And then so now if you say anything, you're a bully, you're hateful. I mean, we just saw it just the other day or yesterday, I think I saw it online with the fencing, and there was a male with a pink helmet having a sword fight, fencing with a woman. You could tell the size difference is crazy. And sort of the person from the fencing organization, meet director, was saying, well, you just have hate in your heart. You have hate. Well, no, calling out a fact is not hate. And in fact, like you say, there's no balancing that, because if you will let it go forward, here's a man pointing a sword at a woman. Like isn't that hate? I mean, that's bullying in the opposite direction. And that's what we're finding when I think that what happens is that when you put the focus on the trans identified person, somehow we've been sort of taught to believe that these are very vulnerable people and somehow they have extraordinary rights compared to everybody else. So when you focus on that person, telling them they can't go into a category where they don't belong is hateful and bullying, but that's completely hiding the fact that allowing that person to be in there is hateful and bullying of the female athlete. So it's like, the two-way camera. You have the camera on the front of your phone and the camera on the back of it. If you focus in one direction and only direction is on the trans-identified person, the whole world and the whole sports, the whole thing context is about their needs and what they have to do and what they're claiming. And so if you deny that, somehow you're a bully. That's why it brings us full circle back to She Won. Because She Won isn't doing that. They're actually putting the focus on the female and saying, how many females have been bullied? How many females have been disrespected? How many females have been had their medals stolen from them? And as soon as you do that, it's very effective. And that's why it doesn't surprise me at all that a trans activist that's within the John Oliver organization and show producer wants to come after SheWon.org because it's doing the very thing they don't want to see happen. The minute you turn that camera around and put it on the female, now we can say the trans activists are bullying the women. So it becomes a struggle as to who's bullying who, actually. And so it's just this whole, sensitivity about how you're supposed to be kind to everybody. But no, I mean, there are things in life that are just facts, and stating facts is, it's not about kindness. It's about being honest. And it's not kind to be lying to people, and definitely not kind to be stealing women's medals. So I don't know. I think it's a fascinating thing. And internationally, or at the level of sport leadership and governance, I've noticed that that's the trick. You tell every sport organization they have to have a trans eligibility policy. And what we ran into in Athletics Alberta was we went around and around in circles with that. What do we do? What do we say if the government wants to know what our trans policy is? And then we realized we had a summit, little bit of a powwow in the Rocky Mountains. We were in this, I still remember, this little cabin, and we're just trying to figure out how do we write this policy. And then a brilliant staff member said, well, we already have a policy. And he said, we have an athlete eligibility policy. And in that athlete eligibility policy, it says all of the responsibilities of a coach, all the responsibilities of an official, all the responsibilities of an athlete. And one of the responsibilities of an athlete is you're not supposed to misrepresent yourself. It was already in there. And we just added now, instead of having a separate standalone trans policy where all the camera has to focus on the trans person, no, the trans person's trying to come into our sport. We have an eligibility policy. They have to abide by our eligibility policies. And when it said an athlete cannot misrepresent themselves, then we added an appendix to that on the situation of a person who identifies as the opposite sex. And in that, all we said was the policy of our organization is if you're born male, you compete with the male. And if you're born female, you have an option either way, because in track and field, if a female runner wants to run with a man, that's a disadvantage to her. And by the way, in SheWon.org, they have a database on the trans-identified males and a separate one on trans-identified females. And the number of medals each has one. Guess what? There are no medals. There is a 0 entry on the trans-identified female who has won a competition in the male division. So, I mean, it's just so obvious that it's a one-way street. So the idea is sport governing bodies are in big trouble. The minute you say you have a trans eligibility policy, no. It should never be like trans is an identity. So is, let's say, being Catholic or Jewish. It'd be like saying, we have a Jewish eligibility policy in the sport. We have a Catholic eligibility policy. We have a Democrat eligibility policy. It doesn't make sense. You compete as an athlete with a sex-based identity or a sex. And so the eligibility, so you don't need a trans eligibility policy. You need an athlete eligibility policy. And everybody who comes into the sport has to abide by the athlete eligibility policy, no matter how you self-identify. And that's where the trick is. The trick is to separate out and say you have to have a separate standalone trans policy. And then that puts all of the focus on the trans person. And then, by the way, internationally in the UN, they say, well, not only should it, but when you have a trans policy and when you have a trans policy for your sport, and now you have to have a meeting about what that trans policy should be, who do you invite? Oh, no, you only invite the trans identified athletes to figure out what their policy should be. because you're calling it the trans policy. And women are not even invited to those tables. And this is what we discovered. In 2021, the IOC, after they were embarrassed by Laurel Hubbard's weightlifting in the women's division, a New Zealand male was weightlifting against the women in Tokyo in 2021 Olympics. Right after that, in August, so the Olympics were in July, right after that in August, the International Olympic Committee admitted, well, we got to go back and rewrite our policy. And then we women on Twitter and other places started noticing that some of the trans activists were bragging that they were being invited to Geneva to the Olympic headquarters to discuss the new trans policy. And we weren't being invited. And so the lawyer, Catherine Deves in Australia, sent a letter to the International Olympic Committee, said, can women please be at the table this time? And they said, well, no, it's not about you. It's about the trans policy. And sure enough, the IOC, new IOC inclusion policy that came out November 2021, sure enough, it just says that we're supposed to, be accepting of people of different sex characteristics. It's just this word salad that basically that allows men to come into women's sports, and it leaves the onus up to women to prove they have a competitive advantage. Like, it's just, they actually have a presumption of no competitive advantage unless women prove otherwise. And the man is going to be in there until we prove otherwise. So if we're not allowed at the table, it's because the focus of that camera has been on the trans person, because the policy label is the trans policy, when it should have never been like that. It's just should be athlete eligibility policy. And then everybody has to fit into that one. So it's a very interesting trick they've played on all of us.
And then there is roller derby. A team of women enthusiastically dominates their league with male players. We saw with San Jose State how even that kind of team enthusiasm can conceal internal turmoil that is created by the presence of a male. So we've seen how males instantly undo the integrity of women's sports, even when everything looks wonderful and inclusive on the outside. So can you explain for the John Olivers of the world just exactly how insidious this kind of inversion is?
Yeah, roller derby had it early. I know that a couple of women in Canada who had to deal with it in Alberta. And it was already happening, the inclusion of males into female roller derby was sort of just a thing. I don't know whether it's because roller derby is sort of this on edge, radical sort of activity. It's a little bit out there, and you dress up into costumes, and it's a free for all, and maybe just the loosey goosey nature of it, and just allowed some of that to start happening. I don't know exactly. I can't answer why they chose roller derby to begin with, but it seems like that was an entry point for some of them, like as far as which sport to start with. And I think it probably has to do with costume and just the nature of it. It's not probably well regulated. There's not sort of international roller derby rules association. I think locally they tend to sort of run on their own. And I just think that women were bullied into accepting it. Those women, I know the women in Alberta who faced it eventually just had to bow out because there were too many injuries. They were getting pummeled, completely wiped out by the men.
Coach Blade, where can listeners find you?
Well, my main area of activism is, I would say on X. I'm at Coach Blade on X, but I also had, like, in that 2021 time frame that I told you about, where women weren't being invited to the table, women from around the world got together, and so we had organizations from each country. She won is after the fact, but they're not part of this group. But we had, for example, Fair Play for Women in UK, and we had Icons Women in the States and Champion Women in the States, and we had Save Women's Sports Australasia. We had groups from around the world that wanted to get together and say, look, if the International Olympic Committee had ever invited women to the table, who would they have gone to? Because I mean, women are 50% of the population. They could go down the hallway to their secretary and say, join the meeting. Now we can say we had women at the table. So we figured, okay, let's make an international organization of all the women's groups who are advocating for fairness in female sports. And so we created this thing called the International Consortium on Female Sport. We have become very effective. So that's ICFS, ICFsport.org. So that's basically our website, and there's a place to send us communications. If you're from any country and you want to let us know that you need some advocacy. And so that, let me give that to you again. It's ICFsport.org. And there's a way to give us feedback there. We have been very effective at writing letters to organizations to advocate for fairness, and they do listen, and we have had some responses. And we do represent women, women from about 10 countries, women's groups who care about women's sport. And so it's very, it's a growing stronger, a group of international sportswomen who are collaborating and growing stronger in terms of our advocacy. I think that would be the best place. And we'd be happy to field inquiries. And in fact, going back to John Oliver, their producer, DMD Brent, also contacted us and wanted a statement from us, just like they did to Wolf and everybody else, the ICFS group. And we chose not to respond because we realized it was a trap to get us to say something where they could just use it for John Oliver to wax poetic in another direction on their outrage towards women asking for fairness. So we are definitely an entity that matters in sport. And we, as ICFS, we went and did check on SheWon.org, and that's why I say I have all the confidence in the world. We do, as an organization, have confidence in the data being collected.
Coach Linda Blade, thank you so much for joining me today.
You are welcome, Matt. My pleasure.
This podcast has been a production of thedistancemag.com, a shelter for the politically homeless. Our discourse examines the gender culture wars from a skeptical and critical perspective. Please visit our website and consider a premium subscription for early access to interviews like this one.